Warning: this story is real, and it's not for everyone. If you listen to the end, you may never look at life the same way again. I was clinically dead. Then what happened changed me forever. Heaven is for real. The most impactful story, based on the testimony of Colton Burpo. One, the day it started like nothing. At first, it looked like something ordinary. The kind of thing that happens in 100 homes every day. A little fever, a tired child, a stomachache that seemed like it would pass after some rest, a warm drink, and a long nap. Colton Burpo was just a little boy, full of energy, full of questions, full of life. He was the kind of child who made adults smile without trying. He laughed loud. He talked fast. He ran through the house like the world was his playground. His father, Todd, was a pastor. He was used to storms, but in a different way. He had prayed with families at funerals. He had walked into hospital rooms with nothing but faith and a Bible in his hands. He had listened to heartbreak, witnessed loss, and begged heaven for miracles on behalf of others. Todd believed in God, but even the strongest believers don't imagine their own child becoming the emergency. Not until it happens. Colton's stomachache didn't fade. It deepened. The sharpness in his voice changed. His cheerful tone turned quieter, strained. "Daddy," he said, pressing a small hand over his belly. "It hurts." Todd tried to stay calm. He assumed it was a flu, maybe a stomach bug, something temporary, something normal. But that night, Colton couldn't sleep. He curled into himself, like his body was trying to protect what he didn't understand. His forehead burned. His skin turned pale. His breathing became shallow, uneven, like each breath had to push past pain. Todd looked at his son and felt something inside him tighten, an instinct older than logic. A father's fear doesn't knock politely. It kicks the door down. Sonia, Todd's wife, was watching too. Her eyes were fixed on Colton's face, with that desperate focus only a mother has, reading signs no doctor can see yet, sensing danger before the diagnosis exists. "I don't like this," she whispered. Todd tried to hold on to his role. Pastor, provider, protector, a man of faith. But the truth was, he was scared. And when Colton tried to stand up and nearly collapsed, Todd didn't hesitate. They were going to the hospital. To the hospital that didn't feel like safety. Hospitals are strange places. People go there hoping for answers. But the building itself is full of uncertainty. Cold lights, long hallways, machines that beep like reminders that life can be measured and that it can also stop. Todd carried Colton in his arms through the entrance. His little boy's head leaned against his shoulder. Too quiet, too weak. The kind of quiet that makes a parent panic. The nurses moved quickly. Questions flew at them. How long has he been in pain? Has he vomited? Does he have any allergies? Is he taking medication? Todd answered, but his mind was running miles ahead. "Please, God, please." Sonia stayed close, her hand never leaving Colton's back, as if her touch alone could anchor him to the earth. Doctors ran tests, blood work, examination. They listened, frowned, whispered to one another. But Colton's condition didn't improve. It deteriorated. He was dehydrated. His stomach was distended. The pain in his belly became unbearable. His little hands clenched and unclenched, like he was fighting an invisible enemy inside him. Todd watched his son writhe in a hospital bed, and suddenly, his faith didn't feel like a comforting blanket. It felt like a thin thread stretched across a canyon. He wanted to be the man who walks into crisis with calm strength, the man who says, "God is in control." But he wasn't thinking like a pastor. He was thinking like a father, and all he could feel was helplessness. Hours passed, then more. Finally, the doctors realized something was terribly wrong. Colton wasn't just sick. He was in danger. His appendix had ruptured. Infection was spreading, the kind that can poison a small body faster than anyone expects. Todd's heart dropped. Ruptured. That word didn't sound like recovery. It sounded like something breaking. And Todd couldn't stop imagining his son slipping away. They prepared for emergency surgery. The nurses moved fast. The medical team spoke in short, sharp phrases. The hospital became louder, faster, more urgent. And Todd and Sonia were forced into the nightmare no parent wants. They had to let go of their child's hand. They had to watch Colton be rolled away. And all they could do was pray. 3. The waiting room where time doesn't move. There's a special kind of torture in waiting. Not the waiting for a package. Not the waiting for good news. The waiting for a surgeon to come out and tell you whether your child lived. Todd sat in the waiting room, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped like he was holding on to his own sanity. Sonia sat beside him, rigid, silent, her eyes glassy with worry she refused to release. The air smelled like disinfectant and stale coffee. People walked by, living their own separate tragedies. Some cried quietly. Some stared at walls. Some clutched phones with trembling hands. Todd had counseled people in rooms like this. Now he was one of them. His mind kept saying, "This cannot be happening." Then reality would punch him again. "It is." Todd stood up, paced, sat down, stood again. Every few minutes, he looked at the clock. But time in a waiting room is warped. A minute feels like an hour. An hour feels like an entire lifetime. Todd's prayers were not elegant. They weren't poetic. They weren't calm. They were raw. "God, please don't take my son." He felt anger rise. Not at the doctors. Not at the situation. At the unfairness of it all. "I'm a pastor. I serve you. I pray for others. I do your work." And then, the thought that terrifies any believer in crisis. Why are you letting this happen? Todd didn't want to admit it. But faith can shake when fear gets loud enough. Still, he prayed. Because even shaking faith is still faith. And it was all he had. 4. The moment Todd thought he lost him. When the surgeon finally came out, Todd and Sonia jumped up so fast their chairs nearly fell backward. The doctor's face wasn't joyful. It wasn't calm. It was serious. And that seriousness crushed Todd's chest before a word was spoken. The doctor explained that Colton had been far worse than they realized, that the infection had spread aggressively, that his condition was critical. Todd heard the words, but they didn't sound real. Critical. His wife's hand found his arm, squeezing hard. Todd nodded, as if he understood, but inside his mind was screaming. Critical means dying. Critical means you might not get him back. They led Todd and Sonia to see Colton. He looked so small in the hospital bed, so fragile. Tubes and machines surrounded him. Monitors tracked what a parent cannot fix with love alone. His face was pale, his lips dry. Todd reached for his hand and it felt too cold. That's when fear stopped being a feeling. It became a physical weight on his chest. Todd leaned forward and whispered, "Buddy, please, fight." Sonia tried to be strong, but tears slipped down her cheeks anyway. Todd wanted to do something. Anything. He wanted to trade places. He wanted to take the pain. He wanted to scream at death itself. Instead, he stood beside the bed and prayed again. Not the kind of prayer you say on Sundays. The kind you say when you're desperate. The kind you say when you're running out of time. 5. The prayer that broke Todd's pride. At one point, Todd couldn't take it anymore. He left the room, walked down the hallway, found an empty space. And there, alone, he collapsed. Not physically, his legs still held him upright, but emotionally, spiritually, he collapsed. He pressed his face into his hands and wept. It wasn't the kind of crying you do when you're sad. It was the kind of crying you do when you're terrified beyond words. "God," he whispered, voice shaking, "I can't do this." He had prayed for healing for strangers. Now he was begging for his son's life. And in that hallway, Todd realized something. He wasn't in control. Not of sickness, not of life, not of death, not even of his own heart. He had spent years preaching faith, but now he was learning what faith truly costs. Faith costs pride. Faith costs certainty. Faith costs surrender. Todd whispered through tears, "If you save my son, I'll do anything." But then he realized his prayer was still too transactional, as if he could bargain with heaven. So he said the hardest words a parent can say. "Even if you don't, I'll still trust you." And when he spoke those words, he felt something shift. Not relief, not peace, but a strange, painful surrender. 6. Colton survives, but comes back different. Colton didn't die. Against the fear, against the odds, he survived. The infection eased, his body stabilized, and slowly, hour by hour, day by day, the boy returned. Todd and Sonia thanked God. They believed the worst was over. They believed the story was finished. They didn't know yet. The miracle wasn't just that Colton lived. The miracle was what Colton would say next. Because after Colton recovered enough to talk, he started saying things that made his parents freeze. At first, it sounded like random child talk. He spoke about heaven with the casual confidence of someone describing a place he'd visited recently, like a trip to a friend's house. Todd assumed it was imagination. Maybe Colton had heard sermons. Maybe he had heard Bible stories. Children absorb everything. But Colton's details weren't vague. They weren't the kind of things a child says just because they heard it once. They were specific, personal, and impossible to explain. Set, Dad, I met Jesus. One day, after the surgery, Colton said something that made Todd's entire world stop. He was sitting in the back seat, as normal as a child could be after a near-death experience. And without warning, in that innocent voice, he said, "Dad, I met Jesus." Todd looked at him in the mirror. "What?" Colton nodded, completely serious. "When I was in the hospital," he said, "I went to heaven." Todd's stomach dropped. He didn't know what to do with that statement. He was a pastor. He believed in heaven. But hearing it from your child isn't theology anymore. It's personal. Todd tried to answer carefully. "Well, what do you mean you went to heaven?" Colton looked confused, like his father was the one not understanding. "I died," Colton said simply. Todd's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He didn't want to hear his child say that. Not out loud. Not like it was normal. But Colton kept going. "And I met Jesus." Todd's mind raced. Could his son be making it up? Could the medicine have caused hallucinations? Could it be a dream? But Colton wasn't acting like a child telling a story for attention. He was acting like someone reporting the truth. 8. The details that shook Todd's soul. Todd began asking questions carefully, gently. "What did Jesus look like?" he asked. Colton smiled. "He has markers," Colton said. Todd blinked. "Markers?" Colton nodded. "Like where the nails went." Todd's throat tightened. Colton wasn't describing a cartoon Jesus. He was describing a crucified Jesus. Then Colton said something else. Jesus had a rainbow horse. Todd almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because his mind couldn't place it. A rainbow horse? But Colton continued with childlike confidence. And Jesus' robe was really white. Todd felt his skin prickle. His son wasn't describing heaven like Hollywood. He wasn't describing angels with harps. He was describing a vivid place, a real place. Todd asked, "What did you do there?" Colton's answer was even stranger. "I sat on Jesus' lap," he said. Todd swallowed. His son's voice was calm, almost joyful, like it was the safest memory he'd ever had. Colton said, "Jesus told me I had to go back." Todd's chest tightened again. Go back? Back to pain? Back to earth? Back to life? Todd stared ahead at the road, but all he could see was the image of his son somewhere beyond the veil. Then Colton said something that made Todd's heart stop. "Dad, Jesus told me you were praying in the other room." Todd's hands stiffened. "Other room?" Colton nodded. "Yeah, you were mad, and you were praying hard." Todd felt his mouth go dry. Because that had happened, Todd had left the room. He had gone into the hallway. He had broken down. Colton wasn't there. Colton couldn't have known. Unless he was telling the truth. 9. I saw Mommy too. Todd was shaken. But the next revelation hit even harder. Colton said, "I saw Mommy too." Todd glanced back. Sonia was in the passenger seat. She turned slowly. Her eyes widened. "You saw me," she whispered. Colton nodded. "You were talking on the phone," he said. Sonia's face drained of color. Todd's mind flashed back. She had been on the phone. She had stepped away, calling relatives, asking for prayer. Colton couldn't have seen her. Not from the surgery room. Not under anesthesia. Not unconscious. Yet he described it exactly. Todd felt something deep inside him crack open. He believed in heaven, but now, heaven wasn't a concept. It was a place his son had visited. Then, and I met my sister. The most devastating moment came quietly. Colton was talking, casually, like it was nothing. Then he said, I met my sister. Todd froze. Sonia's breath caught sharply. Todd whispered, What sister? Colton looked at him like the answer was obvious. My sister, he repeated. Todd's heart slammed in his chest. Because Todd and Sonia had never told Colton. Years earlier, Sonia had suffered a miscarriage. They had lost a baby. It was pain they carried privately. It was grief they didn't speak of often, and they certainly hadn't shared the details with their little boy. Sonia's voice trembled. Colton, what did she look like? Colton smiled. She's really little, he said. Sonia's hands went to her mouth. Tears filled her eyes instantly. Todd felt like the air had been sucked from the car. Colton spoke softly. She hugged me. And then he added something that broke Sonia completely. She said she can't wait for you to come. Sonia cried openly now, shaking. Todd fought tears, his voice barely working. How do you know it was your sister? Colton said. She told me. Then he added, she said she died in your tummy. Sonia sobbed harder. Todd's entire body felt like it was trembling on the inside. Colton didn't know any of that. Not from Earth, not from anyone, but heaven had revealed it. 11. The fear and wonder of believing your child. Todd and Sonia didn't know what to do. They wanted to embrace the miracle, but part of them was terrified. Not terrified of heaven, terrified of being wrong. Because if this was real, then it meant something huge. It meant heaven wasn't just comfort for funerals. It meant heaven was real in a way that could shatter the fear of death itself. But it also meant something else. Their son had seen things they hadn't. Their son had touched eternity. And they were still here, on Earth, trying to understand it. Todd asked Colton more questions over time, slowly, gently. He wanted to catch him in a lie. He wanted the story to fall apart. But it didn't. The more Todd asked, the more consistent Colton remained. The details didn't change. The emotion didn't feel fabricated. Colton never seemed like he was trying to perform. He just spoke, like a child remembering something beautiful. 12. He sings, and the angels sing too. Colton described worship in heaven. He said it wasn't boring. It wasn't forced. It was alive. He told his parents that Jesus loved the little children, that heaven was bright, that it felt safe. He said angels sang. He said people sang too. He said everything felt like joy. The kind of joy that isn't loud or temporary. The kind of joy that feels eternal. Todd asked Colton if he was scared in heaven. Colton looked at him like the idea didn't make sense. Why would I be scared? He said. Heaven is where God is. Todd felt something in his heart soften. He had preached that truth for years. But now it wasn't theory. It was his child's testimony. 13. There's a war coming. Colton also said something heavy. Something that frightened Todd. He said heaven had battles. Not violence like earth, but spiritual battle. He described Jesus as gentle, but also powerful. He described angels. He talked about heaven's strength. Todd realized something deep. The Jesus Colton met wasn't a soft idea. It was the King of Kings. And Todd began to see his faith differently. Not as a religious routine, but as real, alive, eternal. 14. The question that haunted Todd. One night, after Colton fell asleep, Todd sat with Sonia in silence. They had heard so much. They had been shaken. They had cried. They had prayed. But one question remained. Todd whispered it like a confession. What if God really let him see all of that, just so he could tell us? Sonia looked down, wiping her tears. What if, Todd continued, this wasn't just for us? Sonia nodded slowly. Then we have to be faithful with it. Todd swallowed. Faithful. That word suddenly felt heavier than ever. Because if heaven was real, then people needed hope, and Todd knew how many were desperate for it. He had buried too many, comforted too many, watched too many fall apart under grief. Maybe God had sent a message through a child, a message so pure and simple, it couldn't be argued away. Heaven is real. Jesus is real. And death is not the end. 15. Colton's new innocence. After everything, Colton returned to being a child. He played, he laughed, he grew, but something in him remained different. He had a peace that didn't match his age. He spoke of heaven like it was his real home. And sometimes, when Todd looked at him, Todd felt a strange ache. Not pain, not fear. A longing. Because if his son had truly seen heaven, then heaven must be more beautiful than any human words can carry. And Todd began to understand something that changed his preaching forever. People don't just need sermons. They need hope. They need truth that feels like breath. And Colton had brought it back. 16. The moment Todd finally accepted it. One Sunday, Todd stood behind the pulpit. He looked out at the congregation. People sitting in their usual seats. People with hidden pain, hidden fear, hidden grief. People smiling while silently breaking inside. Todd's throat tightened. He thought of Colton. He thought of the hospital. He thought of the waiting room. He thought of the moment he begged God with his pride shattered. And then he realized, God didn't just save Colton. God saved Todd too. Saved him from shallow faith. Saved him from comfort-only Christianity. Saved him from believing heaven was just a concept. Now Todd knew, heaven is a real place. And Jesus is not far away. Todd began to speak. His voice trembled slightly. Not from nerves, from emotion, from truth. And as he preached, he wasn't just telling people about heaven. He was pointing toward it. Like a man who had almost lost everything and returned with something better than answers. Hope. 17. The legacy of a little boy's story. The story spread. Not because Todd wanted fame. Not because Colton wanted attention. But because people were hungry. They were starving for something real. For proof that this world isn't all there is. For comfort that doesn't disappear when tragedy knocks. And people listened. Because even skeptics, even doubters, even wounded hearts, sometimes they cannot ignore a child's pure voice. A child who had nothing to gain. A child who simply said, I met Jesus. And as the years passed, Todd realized this story was never meant to replace Scripture. It wasn't meant to be worshipped. It wasn't meant to become a new gospel. It was meant to awaken hearts, to remind people, faith isn't just tradition. Faith is real. Heaven is real. And love continues beyond death. 18. The most impactful part of it all, but of everything Colton said, the part that stayed in Todd's soul the deepest was this. Colton did not come back terrified. He came back peaceful. He did not come back haunted. He came back hopeful. He did not come back afraid of death. He came back convinced that life continues. Todd realized that heaven had not just changed Colton. It changed the entire Burpo family. Because once you truly believe death is not the end, you don't live the same way anymore. You forgive differently. You love differently. You pray differently. You stop treating people like interruptions. You stop treating time like something endless. You stop treating faith like a routine. You start treating eternity like it's real. Because it is. 19. The final image Todd never forgot. One night, Todd sat beside Colton's bed. His son was sleepy, eyes half closed. Todd brushed his hair gently. Buddy, Todd whispered, are you sure you went to heaven? Colton opened his eyes just enough to look at him, and he answered with the calm certainty of someone who knew more than the world could explain. Yes, Dad. Todd swallowed hard. What was the best part? Colton smiled. Jesus, he whispered, and then his eyes closed again, like a child falling asleep. After telling his father the greatest truth of all time, before you go, if this story touched you even a little, subscribe and follow our channel for more real-life stories that change the way we see life. Hit like so more people can hear this message. And comment, I believe if you believe there's more after this life. See you soon.